Hello friends and welcome back to No Book Left Behind. I'm your host Mark and today it's my June Reading Roundup. So first, apologies for the lateness of this video, but as you can see, we're in somewhat reduced circumstances here at the channel due to the restoration and repair work which is being carried on at the moment on my house, which means that the normal YouTube setup that I have is currently dismantled because that room is in the process of being cleaned and redecorated. And just to give you an idea of quite where we're at with this, here's a quick 30-40 second clip of a swift walk around some of the worst hit areas of the house. So there you have it, that's the current state of play at the moment, which explains these somewhat unfortunate circumstances. I mean, I guess the picture and the sound probably aren't going to be that great. I'll tweak them in post as much as possible, but apologies if they're still a bit rough. We'll just have to see how that goes. The only good thing about all this was that horrible light fixture in the lounge got destroyed. Saved me doing it, I guess. Anyway, let's get on to the reading roundup because that's what we're here for. So how did I get on in June in the midst of all this chaos? Well, the first book I managed to read was a digital one on my Kobo, and that was Museum Piece number 13 by Rufus King, which was originally published in 1946 and immediately optioned by Hollywood and turned into a movie called Secret Beyond the Door, which led at some stage, probably fairly swiftly, into the book being retitled, and it's pretty much known under that title all the time now. Now this story concerns Lily Constable, a young, very wealthy widow who has fallen in love and got married to a newspaper owner called Earl Rumney after a whirlwind holiday romance. Earl is apparently fairly loaded himself, so she's not worried that he's a gold digger and after her money. Her main concern is her forthcoming reception at Earl's palatial country estate, Blaze Creek. In fact, it turns out that her fears are well justified. His sister Diana is aloof and unfriendly. Earl's secretary, Miss McQuilnan, keeps half her face covered with a scarf. And Earl has a son called Aderic, who he didn't bother to tell her about. Also, what Earl had described as a quirky hobby turns out to be something far more sinister than she had imagined. Now, this strange pastime of his is collecting rooms, and not just any old rooms, but rooms where notorious murders have taken place, and he recreates these in a special wing of his mansion. But these rooms feature the original fixtures and fittings, and also in some cases the actual bricks and mortar. Now at first glance, this notion of collecting murder rooms seems like a really good idea for a twisty, suspenseful thriller. It seems to have lots of possibilities, but by the time I got to the end of the book, I couldn't help feeling it was one of those ideas that might seem that way initially, but when you actually try to develop a story around it, you realise it's actually quite problematical. Because there's only really one way it can go. Earl is obviously mentally disturbed in some way and perhaps is after killing his new bride, probably to obtain her money. And that seems kind of the obvious gaslight development of this original notion. And yes, the book does hit quite a few of those beats, even if it's not slavishly down on that template. On the other hand, there certainly isn't anything very creative or interesting about where King takes the story. Probably the most interesting aspect actually is the character of Lily herself. She's very sweet-tempered and polite and desperate to get on with everyone. which results in all these strange characters at Blaze Creek treating her like she's an idiot. Now, the story is told from her point of view, so we know that's not really true, but we keep expecting her to assert herself at some point in the story and behave like a heroine really should, but she never actually does, and we're left with a very passive protagonist. And in the end, you can't help feeling that maybe everyone who thought she was a bit of an idiot might be right. And this might have played okay in the 1940s, but to a modern audience, it really doesn't. The movie that followed was directed by the famous German director Fritz Lang and featured Queen of Noir Joan Bennett and Michael Redgrave. Now, this was the third picture in which Lang and Bennett collaborated, the first two being Woman in the Window and Scarlet Street, and this third one is definitely the weakest of that trilogy. Some significant changes to the novel were made in the film adaptation, mostly revolving around the character of Earl, because in the book he's little more than a plot device. But in the film, they actually flesh the character out. So crucially, we see Lily and Earl's first meeting on holiday, and we see their courtship, which humanises him. And he's presented as a character with psychological damage, rather than just a one-dimensional bad guy. Also, we get some wonderful gothic touches and dream sequences, courtesy of Lang and his director of photography, Stanley Cortez. But the story remains slight, vaguely silly, and the really over-the-top melodramatic score by Miklos Rozsa just makes things almost into an unintentional comedy. It gets by, but only just. And I have to say, it is an improvement on the book too, which I guess gives you a pretty good idea what I thought of that. It's fine if you're not too critical, but you really have to forgive quite a lot of its shortcomings, in particular a very weak final act. Moving on to the first of the physical books I read this month, we've got this one, Blind in One Ear, the autobiography of the actor Patrick Macnee, best remembered of course for the role of John Steed in the hit 1960s UK TV show The Avengers, and this book is subtitled The Avenger Returns. This is an entertaining, if not an outstanding read for me. Now, I don't know about you, but with autobiographies and biographies for that matter, I'm usually finding that the early stages of the book are somewhat of a drag to get through, because it's all about the upbringing and the childhood, the early years, before they got around to what they were famous for and what you want to read about. But in this case, it's actually the opposite, because those early years are the most exciting and interesting part, even fascinating, I would say, because Macnee certainly had a very unusual upbringing. He came from a quite storied aristocratic Scottish family originally, but by the time we got to Macnee's generation, well, his father was an Irish horse race trainer and his mother was a socialite, and they both liked to drink far more than they liked each other. And during one of their periodic splits, his father went to work in India where he was training horses, until one night at a very swanky aristocratic ball, he decided to give a drunken speech from the balcony and then urinate over everyone, which got him deported. During these times of family crisis, shall we say, his mother took Macnee to live with a woman described, or a woman who wanted to be known as Uncle Evelyn. Now, she dressed as a man and kept what Macnee calls a harem of young women at her country estate, where Macnee's mother was wife number one. No men were allowed, save the servants, and save poor little Patrick, who was not allowed to wear trousers because they were forbidden, and had to spend all his time at home in his young years wearing a kilt. So this was an incredibly unconventional upbringing, which Macnee looks back on now, at least in the book rather, with some affection and amusement. He doesn't seem to have been psychologically scarred by it, although it certainly must have been extraordinarily confusing for the young lad. And this is actually, as I say, by far the most interesting part of the book. The rest of it is kind of just a standard sort of career in the theatre, then going into TV. I was surprised there was so little about the Avengers, really. He talks about it a bit, but not perhaps as much as I would have expected. And later on I found out he's actually written a book separately which covers just that show. So I suspect that most of the details you need, if that's what your particular interest is, are in that book rather than in this more general autobiography. But I enjoyed it, but as I say, nothing that I thought was too outstanding. Now the next book is much in the same vein, and although I actually finished this off as my last reading experience of the month, I'm going to group it here because it really fits in as a kind of nice companion piece to the Macnee book, because this is the autobiography of Roger Moore. My Word is My Bond, and of course very famous for playing both the Saint on the TV screen and 007 on the big screen. Now this covers some similar ground to Macnee's book, not in so much in his upbringing obviously, which was far more conventional, but in his early career struggles, his early theatre roles, his small parts on television, small parts in movies, with a bit more emphasis on America and Hollywood, which showed that Moore had a greater determination to make it out there, or at least greater opportunities. Moore's first real small screen success was as Ivanhoe, but obviously it's as Simon Templar that he's remembered in that particular medium. And then of course the leap into spy action on the big screen as James Bond. And I think it's fair to say without those 7 movies that he did as 007, he might have had a little bit of difficulty in sustaining his star status, because otherwise, some of those other projects he did were good enough. His performances in them were decent, but they're not kind of remembered in the same way. Now, Moore comes across as a thoroughly decent chap. Serious about his work, but not serious about himself. There are plenty of anecdotes about the rich and famous, of course, both from the film world and from without. But really, aside from the odd bit of naughtiness, it's all very polite and English. And Moore doesn't really have a bad word to say about anyone, or if he wants to be negative, he tends not to specifically name people, with the notable exception of Jean-Claude Van Damme, who he worked with on a 1996 picture which is now forgotten called The Quest. What stands out about Macnee's book, as I've said, is his early life before acting, but with Moore it's what he did after acting, or at least after Bond, when there wasn't so many acting gigs to be had. And that was his work as a globe-trotting ambassador for UNICEF. All the quips are forgotten here as he talks about his visits to the poverty-stricken areas of the world and the suffering he saw there. It's presented in a very down-to-earth, matter-of-fact and grounded way, and has more impact as a result. It does tend to render the earlier chapters a feeling of inconsequentiality, really, which kind of does overbalance the book, but you can't really argue about how moving some of this material is. Overall, it's a decent read, a solid autobiography, but nothing all that special. Now it's back to fiction for the rest of the month, and my first selection was The Unholy 3 by Todd Robbins. Now this is the tale of a highly unusual band of thieves masterminded by a dwarf named Tweedledee. His partners in crime are a strong man called Hercules and a ventriloquist named Echo, and these 3 are all refugees from a travelling circus. They set themselves up in a pet shop which is apparently owned and run by a woman called Miss Blake, who is really Echo in drag. Tweedledee plays a baby and Hercules just tries to keep a low profile. The shop specialises in the sale of parrots, which Echo gives a voice with his ventriloquism. But of course, when the customers get the birds home, they won't speak. And that means a follow-up visit from Miss Blake, who brings along her baby Tweedledee to find out what's going on. In reality, of course, they're simply casing the joint, and Hercules and Tweedledee will return after dark in order to commit the robbery. And if all that sounds like a setup for a comic romp, well, you couldn't be further from the truth, because this is a twisted tale of resentment and violence, revolving around the warped mind of the psychopathic Tweedledee, who harbours a lifetime of bitterness towards normal people and the civilised world, who have treated his initial noble intentions with laughter and contempt. He couldn't be a darker character, but of course we find out what's at the root of his motivations and the way he's been treated by the world. And strangely enough, this does give him some small sliver of sympathy in the reader's mind. His character is what gives the book the little heart it has, because the nominal hero, Hector MacDonald, is really quite unsympathetic. He's young, he's bolshy, he's arrogant. When he visits the pet shop, which he does regularly without knowing the Unholy Three's true identities or vocation, he spends most of his time trying to get a reaction from Tweedledee's baby by poking it and by blowing cigarette smoke in its face, prompting Tweedledee to eventually fit him for a frame when the trio murder his uncle and steal his rubies. When he's languishing in jail before trial, Hector just spends his time giving controversial interviews to the press and launching his career as a crime author, because he's so arrogant he doesn't think he can ever be convicted. This is a pretty unusual and quite intense read, and it was filmed twice, first in 1925 as a silent and then in 1930 as a talking picture. Both starred the legendary horror icon Lon Chaney in the Echo role. In fact, the 1930 version was the last film he made before his sad premature death. Now, I enjoyed this book quite a lot, although I would say it doesn't quite have the compelling grip of Robbins' previous novel Mysterious Martin, which, if you recall, was one of my favourite books that I read in 2025. But this one still gets a recommendation from me, especially if you like your horror a little twisted and different. And next up we've got a sci-fi novel. Now, I know in a previous or very recent video I made a point of saying about how I don't read sci-fi anymore, and I haven't done for many years. Well, this book was the exception that proves the rule, if you like. And this is Death Sport by William Hughes, which originally came out in 1978. It's the year 3000 and the neutron wars have left the Earth a barren wasteland. The remaining population lives in dome cities, all of which are linked under a central government, aside from Helix City, which remains independent under the rule of despot Zapola. Now, he's planning an attack on the neighbouring Triton city, but needs an incentive to convince his populace to join his army and take part. Recently, some old death machines have been discovered beneath the city, and he's putting them back into use and getting his soldiers to ride them in the gladiatorial contest known as the Death Sport, which is a very popular public spectacle. He's also sent his second-in-command, Ankar Moore, out into the wilderness in order to capture some range guides, desert nomads whose mystical powers have made them legendary. And he figures if his soldiers can defeat the range guides in the Death Sport, then everybody in the city will want to ride those death machines and take part in the attack on Triton City. Now, this is the novelisation, the tie-in to the 1978 movie Death Sport, which was produced by the legendary Roger Corman. Now, I remember hearing about that movie at the time it was released, probably through the ITV movie show for children Clapperboard, which often showed clips from forthcoming movies which never actually made it to British cinemas. Because, Death Sport never had a UK release on the big screen. But strangely enough, I had a vague memory of seeing the paperback tie-in on a newsagent stand back in the day. And one idle moment, a few months back, last year I think it was, I wondered whether I could maybe find that book and see what it was like. And yet, there it was on a popular auction site for a very reasonable price indeed, so I just decided to take a stab and buy it and see what it was like. Now, I first saw the movie many years ago and had very negative memories of it, and rewatching it before I read the book, yeah, it's still pretty bad. It was originally conceived as a thematic sequel to Death Race 2000, if not an actual direct sequel. And I think the idea was to show fast-paced combat action on motorbikes with laser beams. And unfortunately they just didn't have the budget to put that across in any kind of convincing way at all. Worse than that, the drama in between those fight sequences is hopelessly disjointed and doesn't really make a great deal of sense. But it turns out there are reasons for that, because in Hollywood speak it was a troubled production. Now, Cornell often gave young filmmakers their first shot at directing a movie, probably because they were a cheap hire. But this patronage kick-started the careers of luminaries like Francis Ford Coppola, Ron Howard and Jonathan Demme. However, that policy didn't always work. Sometimes it backfired, and that was the case with Nicholas Nishapur, who was originally tasked with writing and directing Deathsport. He was fired midway through filming after clashing with most of the cast, particularly star David Carradine. Alan Arkush was brought in to replace him, but his impression of the project was that it was, quote, beyond salvation, end quote. He did manage to stitch together a movie during the remaining time of the shooting schedule, but the results are not very good. It would be wrong to call it a complete disaster. I mean, you still get David Carradine before his career completely tanked, but yeah, it's not a good watch. Inevitably, perhaps, the novel is a good deal better, because Hughes has 200 pages to fill in those narrative gaps left by the 82-minute movie. Hughes writes in a smart, professional style, and also gives the characters some measure of depth, which was again sorely lacking in the screen experience. If it was a standalone novel, he would likely have done some more world building and probably developed the ending a little more too, as it feels very rushed both on the page and on the screen. It's nothing wonderful, but it's certainly an entertaining read and a much better take on the story than the one we got in the film. And if nothing else, it goes to show that in the wake of Star Wars, every single science fiction movie got a tie-in novelisation. And my next selection in June was Farewell Amethystine by Walter Mosley. Now, this is the latest chapter in the saga of LA's favourite black PI, Easy Rawlins, and the book came out in 2024. Now, regular viewers to the channel will know that I'm a huge fan of this series, especially the later books, and once again I have to say it, Mosley does not disappoint with this one. Now, it's New Year's Eve 1970, and Easy is financially secure and has a loving family, but he's still a black man trying to make his way through white man's America. And he's hired by the bewitching but enigmatic Amethystine Stoller, who wants him to find her ex-husband who has gone missing. Eventually, Easy finds the man, but he's already dead, murdered, possibly due to his connections with organised crime, who had been getting him to do some shady financial work in preparation for a bid to open a new casino. At the same time, Easy's friend in the local police, Melvin Suggs, has disappeared too, because he's found out something very compromising about a senior official within the department. What can I say? Once again, Mosley hits it out of the park. Easy's odyssey through 20th century America is as fascinating as ever, and it's tied to a genuinely engaging and suspenseful plot. The writing's great, and there's also the intrigue of setting Easy up with a possible new love interest in the shape of Amethystine. At one point, Easy asks a mutual acquaintance if Amethystine is telling him the truth and if she is to be trusted. The answers? Well, Amethystine, yes, she is telling the truth. Is she to be trusted, though? Maybe. This is great stuff, a real page-turner, and thoroughly recommended. And next up, we're delving into the world of the vintage paperback, and this is Line on Ginger, a short novel by Maugham, which was originally published in 1950. Our main character is lawyer James Merton, who comes home late one night to find his flat in the process of being burgled. Imagine his surprise when he recognises the thief as Ginger Edwards, a man who joined his tank platoon in the desert during the fighting in World War II. Ginger is hostile, and circumstances lead him to believe that Merton has reported him to the authorities, and so he flees. Merton sets out to find him by visiting their old army colleagues, determined to explain that he did not report him to the police. At first, Merton's odyssey in search of his old colleague is presented as a pretty standard crime story, especially when he discovers that Ginger is involved with the darker side of the black market. As Merton goes from old colleague to colleague, he picks up the odd bit of information here and there which signposts where Ginger may have gone to ground. But the younger man's criminal connections are pretty much irrelevant, and that becomes clearer as the novel progresses. Because in fact, this is a very low-key examination of the difficulty of the outsider to fit into modern society, particularly the one of that period. At first, this seems specific to combat veterans trying to reintegrate after World War II. Merton has very vivid flashbacks of the death of his friend Rodney Savage during the fighting, and he is obviously suffering from a form of PTSD. On the other hand, however, Ginger cannot shake the physical punishment he received from his uncle when he was a boy, and also the way he was treated by a woman prior to getting into the army. Now there's a clear queer subtext here, with Merton almost certainly a closeted gay man, and Ginger's uncle probably motivated, albeit unknowingly, by the repression of his own sexual orientation. It's likely that some of this went over the heads of the audience of its time, but certainly it seems clearer to us when read today. Broadly speaking, though, the wider theme here is about rejection, and how a lack of acceptance can twist the character into violent and even dangerous directions. For the most part, this is efficient and thought-provoking, if a little bit forgettable. However, late on there are a couple of really fine passages of writing which are actually quite moving. There aren't enough of them, and it's a long wait until they arrive, but they certainly elevate the reading experience considerably. The novel was adapted into a film in 1953 called The Intruder, starring Jack Hawkins and George Cole. I've not seen it, but I'm thinking it's likely that the queer subtext is pretty well buried. Author Maugham was the nephew of the celebrated English writer W. Somerset Maugham, and is probably most famous now for The Servant, a novella which became a hit movie which starred Dirk Bogarde in 1963. As an openly gay man, it's fair to say that a lot of Maugham's later work contained a lot of queer themes, and I enjoyed this book quite a bit, although it's fair to say that anyone coming to it expecting a standard crime thriller is likely to go away a little disappointed. Finally this month we have The Bride Wore Black by Cornell Woolrich, which was originally published in 1940. Now this story concerns Julie, a woman who we meet saying goodbye to a childhood friend at the train station. She's bought a random ticket for Chicago with the money that she has, because she's starting out for a new life. But actually, in fact, what she does is get off at the next station and go and hire a flat under a false name. Meanwhile, Reformed Party animal Ken Bliss is attending a party on the eve of his wedding. Out on the balcony, he meets a mysterious stranger. When she loses a handkerchief, he attempts to retrieve it, but as he reaches over the parapet, she pushes him over and he falls many stories to his death on the street below. The case is ruled an accident, even though the woman cannot be found. A few months later, a shiftless veteran is poisoned and dies. The two incidents seem unrelated, but Detective Wagner suspects there may be a connection. The Bride Black was not Woolrich's first novel, but it's fair to say it was his first big hit, and it led to a series of 6 books, all with black in the title, if unrelated plots, which were half of his output of the 1940s and remain his best remembered work to date. The Bride Wore Black was made into a 1968 movie by celebrated French director François Truffaut, which starred Jean Moreau, but I confess to date I've not seen it. However, I have seen quite a few movies that were made in Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s that were based on his work. Unfortunately, even if sometimes there was star power involved, with names like Dan Duryea, Peter Lorre and Edward G. Robinson starring, I usually found the results to be somewhat minor and disappointing, and if the films did not have stars of that calibre, sometimes quite poor. Unfairly, I feel now, this had me pigeonholing Woolrich as an author not worth reading, which is a very flawed argument if you're basing that on the movies that were made from his work, because how often is the movie as good or better than the book? Not often. So I thought it was about time I gave one of his novels a go, and I'm very glad I did. Now the book is split into parts, each containing 3 chapters, the first of which covers Julie's preparations for her next murder, the second, the circumstances of the actual killing, and the third, Detective Wagner trying to put the pieces of it together and connect it with the previous cases. Obviously these last chapters becoming progressively longer as more and more connections appear. And I thought this format worked really, really well, particularly because there are variations in Julie's methods of murder, in the characters that she kills, and the approach Wagner has to take to try and solve the case. It's vivid, it's lively, it's very engaging, and quite the page-turner. Ultimately, I could have done without the final twists in the tale because I thought they really belonged more to a mystery novel than a work like this. And I felt they kind of almost spoiled the simplicity and perfection of the format that Woolrich had come up with to tell his tale, but it's a minor gripe really. The writing is sharp, lean and immensely readable. Woolrich sketches his characters in broad strokes to begin with and then fills in the details with their quirky personal habits and personality tics. It makes for some very vivid portraiture. Also, there's a real sense of inevitability to some of these outcomes, with the victims hastening their fates due to their flaws and personal weaknesses. It's extremely effective. It's noir with an almost tangible sense of fatality, and I really enjoyed it. On this evidence at least, it was a massive mistake to dismiss this author, and I'll be certainly trying out some more of his work in the future. So that's it for this month. Only 8 books, I'm afraid, which is a little low, as last month was high. But yeah, let's see what that's done to the numbers in my Read What You Own challenge. So yes, not a great total this month, but I'm still on an average of 10 books a month, which I'm pleased with because that was my initial aim when I started the challenge. And I'm most of the way through, over halfway at least now, of my Read What You Own challenge, and I'm very pleased with that. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for sticking with me to the end of the video. Apologies if the picture quality and audio isn't quite up to the usual standard. Obviously I haven't done the post-production work on this video yet while I'm still filming it, so I don't know how good or poor that might be, but yeah, circumstances have dictated that, I'm afraid, as I'm sure if you're a regular viewer you realise. So have you read any of these books? What did you think about them? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And in the meantime, please keep searching through those narrow, dusty back streets of your town to find those strange, weird second-hand bookshops. Keep visiting those car boot sales, those market stalls and those charity shops, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Be seeing you.